research. The point is, human curiosity has led us to where we are now. Imagine it's 30,000 years ago. Advanced technological civilization did not yet exist, and the world was a dangerous place you didn't fully understand, and perhaps it still is. As you sit by the fire, maybe after finishing a meal and wondering if the hunt the next day would be successful, you look up at the night sky. What would you imagine those points of light were? What if the night sky changed? Human curiosity continues, and each year new discoveries about the universe appear. Indeed, this is an almost daily occurrence. My guest today has made such a discovery, strange circles of radio emissions in the sky, but he also studies archaeoastronomy, what people in the past thought of and did to study the heavens, and how they interpreted the natural world.
You have fallen into Event Horizon with John Michael Gaudier. In today's episode, John is joined by Professor Ray Norris. Professor Norris is an astrophysicist and science communicator based at the CSIRO Australia Telescope National Facility and Western Sydney University. Professor Norris conducts his research in astrophysics and Aboriginal astronomy. Recently, his team member, astronomer Anna Kopinska, discovered odd radio circles during a pilot survey of the evolutionary map of the universe while using the Australian Square Kilometre Array Pathfinder radio telescope.
Dr. Ray Norris, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Good morning.
Now, Doctor, we have a strange development in radio astronomy. Odd radio circles. We found something new, or you found something new. Can you give us an overview of what these are?
Well, I wish I knew. So what happened where we've built this, CSIRO, Australian Government Organisation, has built this brand new radio telescope in Western Australia. It's able to survey the sky wider and deeper than any previous radio telescope. So we sort of expected that we might find new stuff. You know, whenever you look at the sky in a new way, you tend to find new stuff. So we were observing all these radio galaxies and things, and then one of my colleagues, Anna Kopinska, first noticed are these circles in the image, and we had no idea what they were. At first we thought maybe it's an artifact from the processing, something wrong, and we found no, could see them in different observations. And later on we actually followed up with other telescopes. They are really real. And then we were totally puzzled as to what they were. We went through possibilities. They could have been remains of stars exploding, supernova remnants. There could have been a number of things. And we went through all these possibilities and realized they probably weren't any of these things. And so we ended up with these circles of radio emission in the sky, and we really didn't know what they were, and we still don't.
Now, what do these look like as far as frequency? Are they like just this broadband emission across a large area of space, or is it something a little bit different than that?
No, it's spread over a wide range of frequencies, so it's not like from a molecule or an atom or something like that. It's radio continuum emission. And we've observed them at a few frequencies, all between 1 and 2 gigahertz or thereabouts. And they get fainter as you go up in frequency, but they're still there. We think that's probably a clue as to what might be causing it. So if we've got what they could be, for example, most likely explanation of what's actually causing the emission is electrons generated by something spiraling around magnetic fields, and when an electron spirals around a magnetic field, it produces a particular type of radiation called synchrotron emission, and that has this characteristic of going down in frequency, going down in intensity with frequency. So we think that's probably what's actually generating the emission. So then the question is, okay, so what's actually caused these electrons to be there in these circles? So we're guessing. My best guess is that these circles are actually, we're seeing bubbles of emission, like a sphere of emission which is being radiated out. Now, in several of these, we actually see a galaxy at the center. I should say that when we first discovered them, we had no idea how far away they were. They could have been in our atmosphere. They could have been in our solar system. We think that they're well outside our galaxy now. And in several cases, we actually see another galaxy at the center. And we can measure the distance of that galaxy at the center, and those galaxies are about 1 billion light years away. So that means these circles of radio emission probably are also that sort of distance away, in which case these, if they are spheres, the spheres are about 1 million light years in diameter. So these are absolutely enormous things. My guess is that they may be caused by an explosion in the galaxy, some enormous explosion. We've no idea what actually caused it.
Something perhaps related to a supermassive black hole in the center of the galaxy?
Exactly. So in fact, my guess, I should stress this is only a guess, it could be something like the collision of two supermassive black holes, for example, could produce the sort of energy we're seeing.
So in other words, the afterglow of an enormous titanic collision of black holes in the center of a galaxy, creating a big radio halo.
Yeah, that's right.
There have been a few other options tossed out there that these might be something even weirder than that, perhaps indicative of the mouth of a wormhole. Your view on that?
I love that. That if I had to list my favorites as opposed to the most likely, that'd be my favorite, because that's the most fun explanation. Yes, wouldn't it be great if there were these wormholes in space and we're seeing the mouth of a wormhole? It would be all my childhood sci-fi fantasies come true.
But very unlikely.
I think you'd want a lot more evidence to support that, but we should keep an open mind.
Now, well, as far as likelihood, when you have a wormhole that big, you have to have something holding it open. It's anyone's guess. What is the plan on studying these? What is the next step you're going to take to try to characterize and figure these out completely?
Well, we basically have two fronts. Firstly, we need to study them with other telescopes. I was talking about our new telescope in Western Australia, ASCAP, the Australian SK Pathfinder, which is really good at finding them, and that's probably going to be we're going to find more of them, and as we get more examples, we'll learn more about their properties. And then to go really deeply and study each one individually, in South Africa there's the best telescope in the world for going really deeply, which is a telescope called Meerkat. And we've used that to study a couple of them so far, and we get better images with those. And within this sphere, we actually start seeing structure with meerkats. Still don't know what it means, but it may be bits of debris left over from the explosion, for example. And so we'll use meerkat to try and study more of these. We'll use other telescopes around the world. We need to go in with optical and infrared telescopes to look at these galaxies that seem to be at the center. Can we find any remains of the explosion which may have caused this? And then we'll also use a technique called very long baseline interferometry, or VLBI, where we use telescopes in different parts of the world to try to look at what's going on in the center. Again, can we find remains of some explosion in there?
So how many, I know that the Southern Hemisphere doesn't have as many radio telescopes as the North. So how many telescopes do you have for an interferometer down there to look at at least one in the southern sky?
I'm just thinking about that statement. I don't think I agree with your statement. I think we probably have more radio telescopes in the Southern Hemisphere than the Northern Hemisphere. The very biggest and best, well, there's ASCAP in Australia and Meerkat in South Africa, ALMA in Chile. But the biggest radio telescope in the world, which is just about to start construction in the next few years, the Square Kilometre Array, will also be in the Southern Hemisphere. So it's we're quite well off in the Southern Hemisphere. Of course, in the Northern Hemisphere, probably the preeminent telescope is the Very Large Array in the United States, which is indeed an excellent telescope.
Yeah, well, we sort of we took a hit with Arecibo, but no. The reason I say that is that with the recent SETI candidate, the BLC1 signal, they seemed to be limited on at least SETI equipment that they could use to take a look.
Right. Yes. Yeah. It depends which equipment you're after. I mean, the Very Large Array is probably the most versatile radio telescope in the world at the moment. So ASCAP is a very much a special purpose telescope designed to survey large areas, looking for things like this. Meerkat's really good for going in deep and studying these things. If you want an all-purpose, general-purpose radio telescope, the Very Large Array is probably the preeminent one at the moment. But in fact, these things are going to be in both hemispheres, so this isn't actually an issue. Right now, we found these things in the southern hemisphere, but we think, there's probably several thousand of these in the sky. They're very hard to find because they're so faint. You need a telescope like ASCAP to find them, and we're thinking about how can we mount campaigns. Actually, the best telescope in the northern hemisphere for finding them is probably the LOFAR telescope in the Netherlands. And that can, again, survey large areas of sky very quickly. But so far, none of these have been found with LOFAR. I know some of my colleagues have been looking at LOFAR data, but they are just very hard to find.
Hard to find, but they should be there. I mean, astrophysical phenomena should be, yeah.
Eventually, we'll find lots more, yeah.
Now, another one of your interests, and I found this fascinating, is archaeoastronomy and what ancient peoples and Aboriginal people in Australia knew about astronomy. And the one thing that shocked me was how much they knew, that they were able to work out. I think you called them Aboriginal Einsteins, that were able to work out the workings of the heavens. What amazes you the most about ancient astronomy or Aboriginal astronomy?
I think the most amazing thing is how little we appreciate the knowledge of people like Aboriginal Australians. They have an enormous depth of enormous deep and complex culture with lots of knowledge about the sky, as you say, and also about bush medicine and navigation and things like this. And most of this is not known to non-Indigenous people, and only recently has this started to be highlighted. I find one of the most amazing things is that when the British invaded Australia over 200 years ago, they called the land terra nullius, meaning it's empty land. Nobody owns the land. Well, the Aboriginal people would disagree with that, of course. They had this great civilization in Australia, but their civilization was so different from European culture that the Europeans didn't realize this. They just thought some British people at the time regarded them as being almost subhuman, And we now know that, in fact, these people had a tremendously rich and complex culture. And it's really only in the last few decades that this has been appreciated by non-Indigenous Australians. Anyway, so the bit that I'm interested in, as you say, is the astronomy. And we knew, so it's about 10 years ago I started getting interested in this. We knew at the time that the Aboriginal people had lots of stories about the sky. Obviously, they're interested in the sky. They had stories about different constellations and things. And so that's well known. What interested me was, is it just songs and stories, or did they actually seek to understand how the sky worked? You can say, did Aboriginal people know the difference between stars and planets, for example? And the answer is, well, duh. These people have been staring at the sky, in the darkest skies in Australia, and of course they've been looking at these things, and they knew how the planets moved. Did they understand how tides work? Did they understand how eclipses work? Did they use the stars for practical applications like navigation or setting up calendars, things like this? And the answer to all these questions is basically yes. Of course, the Aboriginal people didn't have telescopes, so they were limited in the amount of information they could get. But given the information that was available to them, they made some really good hypotheses about what was going on up there. And of course, it's all in their own cultural terms. So it involves creator spirits and so on.
Well, one thing they seemed, based on your paper, the one thing they seemed to really understand intuitively was how eclipses worked. They knew that this was the sun and the moon, in the case of a lunar eclipse. And that is not universal in anthropology, because, there are some cultures that had absolutely no idea what were causing eclipses. So I found that interesting, was that they had worked that out.
It is fascinating. And with a solar eclipse, you're looking at the sun in the middle of the day, and you see something blocking the sun, and you can imagine that they might guess that something's going in front of the sun. But a lunar eclipse, you're looking at the moon in the middle of the night and something blocks it. And now, of course, we know it's the shadow of the Earth going across. How did they realize that it was something to do with the position of the sun? But they talk about lunar eclipses being caused by the sun woman and the moon man, or they say the sun woman's chasing the moon man, and when they come together, the moon man's light is blocked. How would you figure that out? I've no idea, and that's where I imagine this a guy or woman sitting out in the desert watching one of these eclipses happening and thinking, what the hell is going on there? And somehow related to the fact that a few hours ago the sun had set diametrically opposed to it in the sky, and realizing that there's something to do with it. And that's why I say, that requires real intellect. And that's why I talk about an Aboriginal Einstein. Of course, we never know the person's name because there's no written records. All we have are these songs and stories which carry these traditions over, perhaps for very long periods of time.
Now, wouldn't that also suggest that they understood the world was round?
That's a really good question. We don't know. So some people, of course, when we say they, you have to realize there's about 300 different Aboriginal cultures. And even within one culture, obviously one person will know more than another person and so on. But when early anthropologists asked people, can they describe the world? So many groups said, oh, we think the world's flat and the sky is maybe a dome above it. And then I think that's probably the most widespread belief. There's this really interesting account from the 1930s of an anthropologist up in northern Australia. And he asked somebody, this is the first contact with these people, with Europeans, and he asked them to describe how the sun moved, and the guy picked up this box and said, oh, it goes like this, and he moved us around the box. So that person clearly had the idea that the Earth is this thin space, and that viewed from the Earth, the sun goes all the way around it. So yeah, clearly that person had that idea, and that person may well have thought of eclipses in those terms, while other people probably didn't.
So that would be an example of an Aboriginal Aristotle, then, where the Earth was the center and the sun was going around it.
Well, that's right, yeah.
Now, the contact with the modern world. I mean, it's Australia, and Aboriginal people are well aware of science and everything else now. How do they see their folk view versus the modern scientific view?
You mean, is there a conflict?
Yes.
I don't think there is. I think you find this around the world with people with, if you like, religious beliefs. I mean, Christians obviously believe in a God, and you can ask somebody, well, where is the God? Because we don't see God with the Hubble Space Telescope. And most Christians say, well, that's a stupid question because it's not like that. It's a different set of beliefs or something. And so you carry these two parallel things in your mind. The scientific explanation, which of course all Aboriginal kids would learn at school. They'd all be perfectly familiar with modern science. And there's also the traditional beliefs, which are still very real. And people really, really do believe this stuff. To give you an example, I work with a senior elder in the Northern Territory. He's a very old guy, one of the last of his kind. And he has these rock art paintings on his land showing creator spirits creating the world. And I asked him, well, so who painted these? They're obviously very old. Do you know who painted them? He said, well, they're painted, but they're not actually painted. They're created by the creator spirits. It's what would have happened was that it's like a photograph being taken, and the creator spirit would have caused this image to appear on the rock. I said, yeah, but you can see there's ochre there. Oh yes, we have to refresh them from time to time. So he and his ancestors presumably have been touching up these pictures to keep them fresh, but the original was created by creator spirits. So, and he really, really believes this, and it's very deep within his culture. And yet he acknowledges that in the current world, you do have to actually use ochre to refresh them, stop them fading.
Now, how old could these be? How old could that tradition be? Because I believe they've been there in Australia for 50,000 years, something like that. Could they have been, all right, say the creator spirit makes the image. Could they have been touching that up for tens of thousands of years?
Yeah, quite possibly, quite likely, in fact. So it's very hard to date paintings. You can't date ochre. You need to get some organic material to do a radiocarbon date. So one or two cases, there's bits of organic material being found underneath a painting. And so some of these paintings have been dated to more than 10,000 years. Some of them show pictures of things like thylacines, which are now extinct in areas where we know there haven't been thylacines for thousands of years. So we know those are very old. One of the there's a lot of stories about the Seven Sisters in Australia, and the story usually goes something like the Pleiades, the cluster of stars that we know as the Pleiades or the Seven Sisters, are a group of young girls, and in the constellation we call Orion, there's a young man or a group of men, and those men are chasing the girls. Now, the funny thing is that everybody calls this group of stars Seven Sisters. You actually only see 6 stars you've got normal eyesight. And so anyway, that's the story. Now, the curious thing is that you go back to Greek mythology, there you find almost the same story. The Pleiades are 7 girls. They're being chased by this young man, Orion, the hunter. But one of the girls, you can only see 6 stars, and even ancient Greeks said, well, you can only actually see 6 stars. And the reason is because one of the sisters fell in love with a mortal or is in hiding. And all around the world, you find these stories about the 7 sisters. Not everybody, many people call them 7 sisters, and then have stories to explain why you only see 6 of them. In Islam, one of the sisters fell down to earth and became the great rock in Mecca. What's really interesting is that, as you say, the Aboriginal culture is very old, about at least 50,000 years. So how come the Aboriginal story is the same as the Greek story? Because there's been no contact between these people for at least 50,000 years. Well, people noticed this decades ago and said, well, maybe Europeans brought the story with them. As far as we know, the story in Australia is really, really old. It goes back probably thousands of years. So how did it get to Australia from Greece, or vice versa, of course? And a hypothesis which my son and I have just been putting forward is that 100,000 years ago, all humans came out of Africa, and we can trace the routes by which they came from DNA testing and so on. And could it be that this story is actually 100,000 years old? Because that's when all these groups last were in contact with each other. And there's a bit of evidence to support that hypothesis, which is that 100,000 years ago, one of the stars in the Seven Sisters was in a slightly different position from where it is now. So 2 of the stars were almost on top of each other at the moment, were more widely separated 100,000 years ago. So it would have actually looked like 7 stars 100,000 years ago. So people looking up would see 7 stars, they call it Seven Sisters. Over that 100,000 years time, it's become more like 6 sisters, but people then have a story to explain where the 7th went. So there's 2 bits of evidence that suggest that it could be 100,000 years old.
Now that would be, to my knowledge, the earliest human folk story preserved.
As far as we know, yes, yeah.
And it's interesting because it's not that different from any other folk story. It's still very human. But yes, this would be the very earliest days, long before things like agriculture and other things that spawned a lot of our other folk tales. This is something even older, to the point that the night sky looked different. Yeah. There's been that much time. I've also found it interesting too, if you look at cave paintings like Chauvet Cave in France, you find evidence where somebody comes along and makes a painting and leaves it partial, and then 8,000 years later somebody else comes along and finishes it. So you see this in other examples of ancient peoples and their traditions. You see this other places where they refresh or finish artwork that was done before. Now we have to take a break, and when we come back, we will talk about the Australian Stonehenge. I'm joined today by Dr. Ray Norris back at home. And we're back with Dr. Ray Norris. Now, Doctor, in Australia, there are stone circles, essentially Australian Stonehenge. Can you tell us about those, and do they serve effectively the same function as Stonehenge?
Yeah, so there's, across Australia, there's many stone arrangements built by Aboriginal people a long time ago, presumably. Very hard to date them, though, because we don't have good techniques for dating stones. So there's one particular circle, a site called Wurdigrang. It's a circle of stones maybe 50 meters across. So not as impressive as Stonehenge, I'm afraid. The stones are up to about a meter high, but very similar to some of the stone circles you get in Britain. So I became interested in this some years ago. A colleague of mine, John Morrison, had first noted that it seems to be oriented to the west, and he suggested that maybe it's pointing to the position of the setting sun at the equinox and the solstices. But he hadn't actually measured it up. It's his hypothesis. And so we decided to survey the site. And with the encouragement of the local Wattarong people, who are the traditional owners of the site. So we did a survey, and the interesting thing was that we confirmed John Morrison's hypothesis. So there's this flattened circle. One end, it's got these particularly large stones. If you stand at these large stones and look out over some lines of smaller stones radiating out, then on the horizon, you're looking at the point where the sun sets. There's three lines of stones. Either the three lines of stones correspond to the two solstices and the equinox, so Midsummer's Day, Midwinter's Day, and the equinox. So that was really interesting. It looked like this was built at least to represent these positions of the sky. You then wonder, well, that's really interesting. Are these, could it be a hoax? Could it be an accident? Are we just making things up and finding stones that support our hypothesis? You have to think about all these possibilities. So a couple of things. Firstly, we noticed in the survey that, as well as the little lines of stones that John Morrison had noticed, that the circle itself wasn't really a circle, it's more of a kite shape with two pretty straight lines along two parts of the circle. And in fact, these two lines also pointed at the position of the sun on Midsummer's Day and Midwinter's Day. So that pretty well rules out a hoax. It's not just a question of putting a few stones for these lines. You've actually got to get bulldozers and things to move the stones in this big circle to do this. So clearly the intention of the Aboriginal people was to have these lines pointing in this direction. The other thing we wondered, could it be due to chance, or made a computer model? We did some simulations, see if you put circles and stones randomly around the place, what are the chances of them lining up like that? And the answer was actually negligible. It's extremely unlikely to be a chance thing. So yes, so the evidence is that the Wattarong people who built this, presumably thousands of years ago, though we don't actually have a date, they were actually using it to observe the position of the sun setting on Midwinter's Day and Midsummer's Day and the equinoxes. So why did they do this? Well, we've absolutely no idea. Was it an observatory? We've no idea. It's almost suddenly a ceremonial site for some reason, and it somehow had to do with the position of the sun and moon. Unfortunately, the Wattarong people, their culture was basically wiped out by the British invasion 200 years ago. And so we've got nobody with any folk memory of how this was used. But we've just got this monument set in stone telling us that the people really did know about this stuff. And the interesting thing, these lines are quite accurate within a few degrees. So it actually helps answer another question about how people navigated. When we look around the country, we find stories that people would use the sky to navigate, and we find lines of stones which seem to be oriented north-south and east-west, again, accurate to a few degrees. And so very clearly the people knew the position of north and south and east west to a few degrees. How do they measure this? So if I asked you to go and tell me where due west is, you might say, oh, it's where the sun sets. Well, no, it isn't. The sun sets anywhere from northwest to southwest, depending on the time of year. And to get actual due west within a few degrees is really quite hard. You've got to make measurements. And clearly that's what these people were doing at the site where Diorang.
Now, how did they travel? I mean, Australia is an unusual continent in that everybody lives on the coast, and the interior of it is just a vast plain. How did they even bother to venture into that? And if they did, could that have been using the stars to navigate to get across the Null Arbor Plain?
Yeah, so as you say, most people in Australia live around the edge, but in fact there are communities living in the middle, and they're very ancient Aboriginal communities who did live in the middle. And to answer your question, yes, so actually people did travel around. And what we now know from archaeological evidence is that people traded things right across Australia. So very different from the sort of the lack of civilization the British thought they found when they arrived. We now know there are these great trade routes, and you find knives from South Australia appearing in the Northern Territory, and ochre from the Northern Territory appearing in South Australia. So people were trading these things right across Australia. And nearly 100 years ago, anthropologists were trying to map out these great trading routes. What I find fascinating is that the anthropologists knew that people were trading stuff. They knew they took these routes across Australia, which go right across Australia from east, west, north, south. Some of your listeners may not appreciate, Australia is roughly the size of the United States, so it's a long way. And what I find interesting is that the anthropologists doing this work 100 years ago never asked the question, how do these guys navigate? Because clearly they did navigate. They really knew how to navigate long distances with a lot of accuracy. And we're starting to understand this. So one way is they use the sky much as we would use the sky. They know the directions. They know that to get to the Northern Territory, you go north, and they'll use the sky to help them do that. But of course, you need to do much more than that. You've got to know how to avoid the swamps, how to get around a swamp, what are the best places. And so there are things called song lines. I'll give you an example of a song line. In the Northern Territory, the Yolngu people say that the planet Venus, they call Barnaby, she came to Australia, leading the first humans to Australia. She came over the sea from the east, and she led the humans to the coast of Australia, and she was singing this song describing the land beneath her. So as Venus crossed the land, she described the mountains and the swamps and the coastline and the good camping places and the water holes. And so if you know the words of this song, you can use it like an oral map. So you might be traveling along from east to west as Venus, Barnaby did, and you know the words that you come to a mountain, you think, which side of the mountain do I go? Do I go to the north or do I go to the south? And you go through the words of Barnaby's song, which says to the left of that mountain, there's horrible swamp which you don't want to get into, and to the right is a really good camping place. There's a water hole a bit further, about a day away, up that way, and so you go to the north. And so we know that people in Australia had these song lines which told them how to navigate across the land, and all of Australia is crisscrossed by these song lines. And we think this is a major way that people navigated, but we're still learning about it.
So essentially the map is in the song, and that's absolutely amazing, because if you think about it, a song is much easier to remember than a list of directions.
Absolutely. So it's really interesting that, as you say, songs are much easier to remember, which is presumably why these things are coded into songs. And then the other thing is that in some places people use the stars as reminders for the songs. So it's not that they're actually mapping the land onto the sky, but they can trace out the path of the song. They'll go from one star to another. So one star will be where there's a river crossing, another star will be a water hole. And so kids will sing these songs looking at the stars and pointing at the stars as they go through the song. And so there they're using the stars as a mnemonic to remind them. It's very much like the technique of memory palaces and things that people use to remember long lists of instructions. You need something to tag it to help you remember stuff.
If the Australian Stonehenge is basically a calendar, it's not without precedent. Humans have built these. Obviously, there's Stonehenge in England and Avebury and those types of circles. And there's also things in France, I know. But also here in North America at Cahokia, the Indians seem to have done it with a wood henge. And so there's precedent in other human cultures for creating this. So is it that surprising that it would be in Australia? But I wanted to ask you, could it simply have been to predict the seasons, know when winter's coming?
I don't know is the obvious answer, but I sort of think there has to be more to it than that, because one thing that's only going to tell you about the seasons in one place, that might be useful for those people. It's not much use to people 100 miles away. It seems to be much more important than that. When you look at the current Aboriginal calendars, people mark the seasons. By the way, they often have 6 or more seasons in the year, and they mark the boundaries by what stars are rising, fairly obviously, also by what flowers are coming out, what birds are migrating and things like that. So they have a whole load of indicators which tell you when one season is changing to another. I'm not sure that you'd want a stone circle for that, but you might be doing it to try to understand how these seasons are tied in with the motion of the sun. We're just guessing. I just wish we could ask the people how they did this.
That's the unfortunate thing, isn't it? Because as far as I know, everybody that's built a stone circle they're no longer, nobody knows. So you can't ask someone that built Stonehenge. They're long gone and all information is gone. And same with Cahokia and now Australia, there's just no one to ask. So we don't actually seem to have an example of one of these these stone circles where there's anybody left that could explain it.
That's right. I mean, it's wrong to say that all the information is gone, because as archaeology gets better and better, you get more and more information out of the site. And we've seen this, particularly at Stonehenge in England, where people's original ideas now seem very primitive. There's been so much work done on it. It's like search information pulled out from the ground. We know a lot more about Stonehenge, and no doubt there'll be other techniques in the future. We have radiocarbon dating now. There may well be other techniques like that in the future that we don't yet know about.
My one last question for you, Doctor, today is you also wrote a novel. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, that was a bit of fun. So it's about a young English academic who his girlfriend dies tragically in a car accident, and he becomes convinced that a pagan cult, the Wiccans, are responsible for it. So he's determined to find out who did this. And so he decides to infiltrate the Wiccans. Of course, he's a total atheist, he's a scientist. He doesn't believe in the pagan religion at all. But as he gets more and more into Wicca, he discovers there's much more to it than he realizes. And I don't want to give any spoilers away, but his life, he becomes so obsessed by this that his work deteriorates. He changes being a respected academic. He gets involved in all sorts of things. He ends up being hunted by the police. And I'm probably saying too much now. But a lot of it is set around, the early part is set around British academia and the political fights that happen in academia, and then gradually explores the world of Wicca, which I find fascinating. I mean, I have to say I'm a total atheist myself, but I find religions like Wicca and its origins in what used to be called, or what is still called, witchcraft, I find them fascinating. How culture has moved on to the Middle Ages, and how some of the things that were given a very bad press, I think, with the witches, and which we now know are perfectly reasonable religions, worshipping earth spirits and so on, and these still persist in modern day, well, England and the United States. I know that Wicca is a very rapidly growing religion in the United States. I just find that fascinating.
As do I. Now, the book is entitled Graven Images by Ray Norris. And where can everybody get this?
Amazon is the best place to go. And it's available on Kindle as well.
Well, Doctor, thanks for joining us today. And as soon as we find out anything more about the odd radio circles or the Australian stone circles, circles in the sky, circles on the earth, we'd love to have you back.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure.
That reminds me, I bought some new valves this week to increase my vocal range.
Oh, that's perfect, Anna. Just what we need. And what was the result?
Leave Sprocket alone. Leave him alone.
Yeah, Anna, you're a real Bob Dylan there.
Oh.
When your AI starts ordering custom parts, there's always shenanigans afoot. And on that note, next week we have a surprise show. Never know what's gonna show up on this channel. See you then. Anna, take it away.
Don't mind if I do, John.
It's true that you observed him in your box, and now he's solving Fermi's paradox. He'll replace your burgers with banana bread. He might be colluding with your AI assistant. Your AI assistant. He's colluding with your AI assistant. The quantum mechanical opossum. Leave him alone.
Scan detected.
Fighter is deployed.
Scan detected.
retrieval.
Cargo scoop deployed.
We've got the fighter back in the bay, Commander.
Flight assist off. Flight assist on. Cargo scoop retracted. Frameshift charge detected.
Affirmative, Commander. Establishing fighter link. Link established. Awaiting instructions.
Temperature critical. Target shields offline. Target destroyed. Cargo scoop deployed.
Go for automated retrieval, Commander. Flight and retrieval sequence complete, Commander. We're clear to depart.
4, 3, 2, 1. Engage. objective detected. Scan detected.
Okay, Commander. I'm opening up the fighter bay now. Fighter is deployed.
Warning. Temperature critical. Target shields offline.
Friendly fire isn't, Commander.
Cargo scoop deployed. Cargo scoop retracted. Target shields online. Warning. Temperature critical. Under attack. Target shields offline. Under attack. Target destroyed. Cargo scoop deployed. Cargo scoop retracted.
fighter back in the bay, Commander.
Frameshift drive charging. Fuel scooping. Fuel scoop disengaged.
Jupiter Rochester named in Starship One trial. Core Dynamics CEO Jupiter Rochester has been accused of collaborating with Fleet Admiral Vincent to orchestrate Starship One's destruction in 3301. As reported by Ethan Takahashi for the Federal Times, financial data was presented to the court showing that Vincent, along with others in government and the Federal Navy, received colossal payments via shell companies created by Jupiter Rochester's loyalists. The prosecution claimed that Rochester and Vincent were reacting to then-President Jasmina Halsey's intention to scale back military spending, which would impact Core Dynamics' profits. They arranged to assassinate her and lay groundwork for Zachary Hudson to be voted into power, knowing that his policies would result in further naval contracts. The defense argued that Halsey's testimony was unreliable and that the financial data was obtained via improper methods, so should have been inadmissible. It was also pointed out that the Rochester family had many enemies determined to besmirch their reputation. The jury has now been sequestered to determine a verdict. This means they are unaware of media reports that several Core Dynamics departments, known collectively as Jupiter Division, are transporting ships and personnel to the HIP 54530 system. Other sources confirmed that the HIP 54530 Gold Universal Group has officially assumed the name Jupiter Division, suggesting that it was heavily infiltrated by Rochester's loyalists. The faction has retained control of the permit-locked HIP 54530 system. Engineers Enhanced Missile Rack Initiative. Pilots Federation alert. The engineer Liz Ryder has requested mined materials to help make a previously unique ship module widely available. The module is a fully engineered lightweight and high-capacity Class 2 Seeker missile rack with thermal cascade. It was offered in October 3306 to pilots who helped defend the Eurybia system from Imperial forces. At the time, the Empire suspected Liz Ryder of supplying weapons to the NMLA terrorist group. Ms. Ryder has announced that her aim is to make this specially modified weapon available for purchase at all human technology brokers. She added, "Pilots can help kick-start this project by providing mined commodities, which will temporarily reduce the amount of materials that customers require to obtain the missile rack. As a bonus, the highest contributors to this initiative will be gifted with the module. I'm pleased to be working with tech brokers to add this to the market. Many engineers think we could do more to serve the galactic community, and this is a step in that direction. Shipments of bromelite, lithium hydroxide, osmium and samarium can be delivered to a Wyra Flurble in the Eurybia system." Empire denies existence of secret prison. Pilots Federation alert. an Imperial Intelligence detention facility discovered in the RCRA Sector AFAD-42 system has been repudiated by the Empire. The outpost, named Serene Harbor, was located after its distress call was shared publicly by the Pilots Federation. According to the commander Andy X, who first investigated the site, all its occupants were dead as the result of what appeared to be a prisoner breakout. Unlike the Imperial Internal Security Service, the Imperial Intelligence Organization has no spokespeople or public channels. However, Senator Carl Nerva told the media, the claim that high-security prisoners and terrorists are being tortured for information in an unregistered outpost is categorically false. There is no such place as Serene Harbor. We believe that independent pilots have been duped by a federal ploy to undermine the Empire, using fake locations and logs for theatrical effect. I assure all citizens that Imperial Intelligence operates fully within the law and remains vigilant against all threats. When asked about Commandant Gabriel De Luca, who was identified by surviving
Core Dynamics Bravo 12th of November. Stockholm welcomes you to Alliance territory. Fly safely while in and around the starport. Landing
logs at
permitted.
the outpost,
Clear to land on
Senator
pad
Nerva
3A.
replied, Captain De Luca was indeed an agent of Imperial Intelligence, but died on active duty several years ago. It's obvious that this respected hero's identity has been stolen to add credibility to anti-Imperial disinformation. Core Dynamics implicated in Starship One sabotage. Evidence presented at the trial of Fleet Admiral Vincent suggested financial links to Federal Shipbuilding Corporation Core Dynamics. This
Scan detected.
significant
2,000 meters to touchdown.
development was covered by Ethan Takahashi for the Federal Times. The initial investigations around Starship One's destruction in 3301 were outlined by the prosecution. When the Federal Attorney's Office revisited this historical data, traces were found of financial transfers routed through non-Federation banking
Landing gear deployed.
systems. The FAO brought in the expertise of the Wallglass Investigations Agency, which discovered that these transactions were made via shell companies created by Core Dynamics. Fleet Admiral Vincent, as well as several other naval
Contact. Commence system shutdown.
officers received billions of credits through these companies that went undeclared.
Incoming message. Incoming mission critical message.